Her hands trembled as she held the phone to her ear, her breath uneven. The moment his best friend's voice came through, her stomach twisted into knots. "I know what you're doing." His voice was calm but firm. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He knew. Her throat went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." A quiet sigh came through the phone, one filled with disappointment rather than anger. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the messages. I know who you've been sneaking around with." Her heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the words. How? How had he found out? She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay even. "Please, just don't say anything. It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," he cut her off. "And if you don't end it now, I'll tell him." A sharp pain stabbed at her chest. He was serious. He wasn't bluffing. Her mind spun with ways to fix this. Maybe she could deny it. Maybe she could convince him it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew there was no way out of this. He had proof, and proof changes everything. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Things haven't been the same between us." He scoffed. "So this is how you handle it? By throwing away everything? By sneaking around behind his back?" Tears burned in her eyes. "Please, just give me time." A long pause stretched between them. Then his voice dropped, low and cold. "You have a choice. You either tell him yourself, or I will." The line went dead. Her fingers loosened, and the phone slipped from her hands onto the table. This couldn't be happening. She had been so careful. No calls when her husband was around, no obvious signs, no careless mistakes. But she had overlooked one thing: his best friend. He had been watching, noticing, putting the pieces together. And now it was over. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she tried to think. Maybe he wouldn't go through with it. Maybe he was bluffing, but deep down, she knew better. She had one option left: tell her husband before his best friend did. Her stomach churned at the thought. What would he say? How would he look at her? Would he ever forgive her? A wave of nausea rolled over her. She had spent so much time enjoying the thrill of the affair that she never considered what would happen if she got caught. And now she was out of time. She never meant for it to happen. At least, that's what she told herself. Her marriage had started like a dream. Late-night conversations, laughter over coffee, whispered, "I love yous," when no one else was around. But over time, something changed. The conversations grew shorter. The laughter became rare. The warmth between them faded into a comfortable routine. But comfort didn't feel like love anymore. Her husband was a good man. He worked hard, always providing, always responsible. But in doing so, he became distant. Work became his priority, long hours turning into late nights, exhaustion replacing affection. She felt more like a roommate than a wife. At first she tried to ignore it. She convinced herself it was normal, that this was just what happened after years of marriage. But loneliness settled in like a cold weight on her chest. And then he came along. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something she looked for. A man from work, a friend from the past, someone who saw her. It started as harmless conversation, small compliments, casual jokes, nothing inappropriate. But the way he looked at her was different. He noticed things. The way she changed her hair, the sadness in her eyes, the way she hesitated before answering when someone asked how she was. "You don't seem happy," he had said one evening. She laughed it off. "I'm fine." But deep down, she knew she wasn't. The messages started after that, just checking in, just friendly chats, until they weren't. She told herself it was nothing, that she wasn't doing anything wrong. It was just talking, just attention, just a little piece of something that made her feel alive again. Then one night, it changed. She and her husband had argued. Another fight about nothing, another silent dinner, another night spent on opposite sides of the bed. She felt invisible. She picked up her phone and typed out a message. "Are you still up?" The response came almost instantly. "Always, for you." Her heart raced. She knew she should stop, that if she continued down this road, there would be no turning back. But she didn't stop. She met him for coffee, then for lunch, then for drinks. The first time he touched her hand across the table, she didn't pull away. The night it turned physical, she barely hesitated. She told herself it would be once, a mistake, a moment of weakness. But it didn't stop. And with each stolen moment, she convinced herself she could have both. Her husband would never know. She could keep this secret forever. She had no idea how wrong she was. The moment she saw his name on her phone screen, her stomach dropped. Her husband's best friend never called her, ever. They were friendly, sure, but they never had personal conversations. He was his friend, not hers. She hesitated before answering, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Hey, what's up?" There was a pause, a long, heavy silence that made her grip the phone tighter. Then his voice came through, low and firm. "We need to talk." A chill ran down her spine. There was something in his tone, something she didn't like. She forced a small laugh. "About what?" Another silence. Then the words that made her blood run cold. "I know." Her heart stopped. Her fingers tightened around the phone as her mind spun, scrambled, searched for a way out. I don't know what you mean," she managed, but her voice wavered, betraying her. "You do," he said simply. No emotion, no hesitation. He was sure. Her breath caught. This couldn't be happening. She had been careful. No public meetings, no careless texts when her husband was around. How could he know? "You're wrong," she whispered, a quiet chuckle, bitter and sharp. "Don't insult my intelligence." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Look," he continued, "I haven't told him." Yet. Yet. That word hit her like a slap. She swallowed hard. "Please," she whispered, "just don't. It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think." His voice was steel now. "And I'm giving you a choice. End it, now, or I tell him everything." Panic clawed at her throat. End it? Just like that? Could she? Could she really walk away from the one thing that made her feel alive again? Her thoughts raced. Maybe she could convince him not to say anything. Maybe she could lie, twist the story, make him doubt himself. "You don't understand," she tried again. "It's complicated." "No, it's simple," he shot back. "You either fix this before it's too late, or you lose everything." The line went dead. She stared at the screen, her hands shaking. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her affair had always felt like something under her control. She had never thought about what would happen if someone else found out. Now she had no choice. She could end it and try to fix her marriage. Or she could keep going and pray that his best friend didn't follow through with his threat. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was out of time. She walked into the house as if everything was normal, setting her purse down on the counter the same way she did every day. But something felt different. The air was heavier, colder. Then she saw him, her husband, sitting at the dining table, hands clasped in front of him. His face was unreadable, his posture too still, too controlled. Her chest tightened. Something was wrong. "Hey," she said carefully, forcing a smile. "You're home early." He didn't answer right away. He just sat there staring at the table. Then he looked up. And she knew. Her heart dropped, her fingers instinctively tightening around the strap of her bag. This was it. "Sit down." His voice was calm, too calm. Her stomach twisted into knots, but she obeyed, pulling out the chair across from him. Her hands felt clammy, her breath uneven. He let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "Tell me the truth." Her mouth went dry. She knew exactly what he meant. But she wasn't ready for this. She let out a nervous laugh, trying to mask the panic rising in her chest. "What do you mean?" His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the table's edge. He was losing patience. "I'll ask one more time," he said, his voice quieter now but sharper. "Tell me the truth." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had lied before. She had covered her tracks, convinced herself that if she played it right, she would never get caught. But something told her that this time it wouldn't work. She swallowed hard. "I don't—" Then he reached for his phone. With a few taps, he turned the screen toward her. And there it was. Messages, photos, calls, proof. Her entire body went numb. Her mind screamed at her to say something, to deny, to fight back, to make up an excuse, but there was nothing left to say. The ground beneath her felt like it was crumbling. "How long?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Her throat clenched shut. I don't... How? Long. Tears burned in her eyes, but she knew they wouldn't help her now. He already knew the answer. She had spent so much time thinking she could have it all, that she could keep her marriage and her secret. But now there were no more secrets, no more lies, only consequences. She braced herself for the shouting, for the anger, for the explosion that should have come after her betrayal was laid out in the open. But it didn't come. Instead, he just looked at her. No words, no yelling, no accusations, just silence. And that was worse. She had expected rage. A part of her had even hoped for it. If he screamed, if he cursed her name, if he hated her out loud, at least she would know he still felt something. But he didn't. He just sat there staring at her like he didn't recognize the person in front of him. His hands, usually steady, clenched into tight fists on the table, not in anger, but in restraint, as if he was holding himself together with the last bit of strength he had left. The silence stretched. Finally, his best friend, the man who had exposed everything, shook his head in disgust. "You deserved better than this," he muttered, breaking the unbearable quiet. Her stomach twisted violently. She hadn't just betrayed her husband. She had betrayed all of them. His best friend, their friends, his family, everyone who cared about him. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her husband exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, too quiet. Why? Her heart clenched painfully. She had so many excuses. She felt lonely, she felt unseen, she wanted something more, but none of them mattered now. None of them justified what she had done. She swallowed hard. I don't know." A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "That's the best you've got?" His best friend scoffed. Unbelievable. She had never felt smaller. She had convinced herself she was in control of the situation, that she could have her secrets, have her affair, and still keep the life she had built with him. But now, sitting across from the man she vowed to love, watching the way he struggled to even look at her, she realized something awful. She had already lost him. He shook his head slowly. "I can't even be angry at you." Her breath hitched. Because anger meant there was still something left to fight for. But disappointment meant it was already over. He stood up from the table without another word. No yelling, no threats, no final plea for an explanation, just silence. She watched, frozen, as he walked past her, his face blank, his movements stiff. Her chest tightened as he made his way toward the bedroom. Then the sound that shattered her world, the slow, deliberate pull of a suitcase zipper. Her stomach dropped. He wasn't asking for time. He wasn't demanding answers. He was leaving. She pushed up from her chair, her legs shaky beneath her. "Wait," she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. But he didn't stop. He moved methodically, grabbing clothes from the closet, tossing them into his bag without hesitation. His best friend leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. There was no sympathy in his eyes, no hesitation, only certainty. She turned to him desperately. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice cracking. "Please just stop." Her husband's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. He still wouldn't look at her. She swallowed hard. "We can fix this." That finally made him stop. He let out a slow, bitter laugh, shaking his head before turning to face her. His eyes, once filled with love, were now empty. "No," he said simply. "We can't." Her breath hitched. "You made sure of that." She felt the weight of those words settle deep in her chest. She opened her mouth, but what could she even say? Sorry? She had spent months lying, sneaking around, choosing someone else over the man who had given her everything. And now he was done. His best friend pushed off the wall, grabbing a second bag. "Come on," he said, looking at her husband. "Let's go." Her stomach churned. They had already planned this. This wasn't a reaction. It wasn't a rash decision made in the heat of the moment. He had known. He had prepared for this, and she had been too blind to see it. Panic surged through her veins. "We need to talk about this, just us, please." Her husband's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to talk about." Her vision blurred. This wasn't happening. He grabbed his bag, walked past her without a second glance, and headed for the door. "Wait," she cried, her voice breaking. But he was already gone. The door slammed shut behind him, and just like that, she had lost everything. Her marriage, her security, her place in his life. She turned back to the empty room, to the mess she had created, and for the first time she realized there was no one left to blame but herself. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone, her hand shaking as she scrolled through the messages she had sent. Every single one had the same response. Nothing. Her husband had blocked her. Her calls went straight to voicemail. The messages stayed unread. The man she had spent years with, the man she had promised forever to, had erased her like she never existed. Her stomach twisted as she dialed again, hoping, praying that maybe this time he would pick up. Maybe this time he would give her a chance to explain. But the line went dead immediately. Tears blurred her vision as she gripped the phone, fighting the urge to throw it across the room. She had thought she could fix this, that if she begged, if she showed enough regret, he would at least listen. But he wouldn't. She had spent months lying to him, betraying his trust, taking him for granted, and now he had finally learned how to live without her. Her pulse quickened as she tried another number, his best friend. Surely he would listen. Maybe he could talk to her husband, convince him to hear her out. The call rang once, twice, then it cut off. She tried again. This time it didn't even ring. Her breath caught in her throat. He had blocked her too. A wave of nausea rolled over her as reality hit her like a slap to the face. It wasn't just her husband she had lost. She had lost his best friend, his family, their friends. Her entire life had unraveled in a matter of days. She gripped her phone tightly, opening her texts one more time, scrolling to the last message she had sent him before everything fell apart. "Please talk to me. Please, I need to explain." The words sat there, unread. Her vision blurred as she stared at the screen, her mind replaying every choice she had made, every moment she had convinced herself she was getting away with it. She had thought she had control, that she could have both, her marriage and her affair. that as long as she was careful, she would never get caught. But in the end, she had lost everything. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself.